We'll start in immediately. Oh, thank you. Right. Normally it's my shouting does the trick nicely, but very welcome to this next session, at the thematic session on human rights and policing. My name is Noeline Blackwell, and I was a member of the Commission on the Future of Policing. I'm very honoured to be that, and still thrilled with the report. But one of the things that was interesting about the development of the report, and I don't think I'm giving away trade secrets, was that the 10 principles that come up at the end were really just developed and bubbled up from the work of the Commission, and just trying to work out what the various strands were that we were going to come out in the report. And funnily enough, the first principle now is the principle that human rights is fundamental to policing. But it was one of the last to be developed, because I think it underlay all of the other areas. It wasn't a specific issue. It was going throughout every single strand of the report. And so, and when it did come out, and when we were able to say, as we were, that human rights is the very basis for policing and the justification for having a police service, we were glad then to be able to put that as the first principle. Now, we have 4 really excellent, involved speakers who have very different perspectives on this, and I'm just going to now pretty well hand over to them. As a chair, I'm pretty useless at directing what people will say, but I'm great at keeping time. So I'm going to ask all my speakers to keep to time, and I'll hassle people who go over time. And if I do that, we might just have a few minutes for comments from the audience as well. So that's putting extra pressure on the speakers as well, because now they'll feel bad if they go over time. So my first speaker is the Chief Commissioner of the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission. The Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission is Ireland's independent national human rights and equality institution. It is therefore a very important monitor and guardian of human rights and equality in Ireland. It is to protect and promote human rights and equality and build a culture of respect for human rights, equality and intercultural understanding. Emily Logan has been the first Chief Commissioner of that. Before that, she was the first Ombudsman for Children, so she's a whole load of firsts. Is this your first time talking in this building, Emily? In this building? All right, not even in the building. She can't claim another first for her. Her biography is in your pack, and I'm going to just leave it at that and ask Emily to take the floor to discuss human rights and policing. Thank you.
Díomh go léir and gur maithagad to Donnacha O'Connell for the kind invitation to be with you here today, and congratulations to Professor Mullally and to Donnacha for the collaboration that is the conference today. In her introduction in the report on the future of policing, Kathleen O'Toole notes that while public confidence has been shaken in the wake of tribunals and news stories, that the majority of people in Ireland still continue to support Garda Síochána and are eager to work in partnership with them to improve not only safety but also to enhance quality of life of their communities. And it's in the spirit of support and a shared desire to ensure that policing in Ireland is something that we can all be proud of that I'm delighted to be here on behalf of the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission to offer some reflections on the opportunities that are currently before us to ensure that human rights and policing go hand in hand in the years to come. I will be within time, and myself and Liam and Alan and Eilis have all spoken to each other in an effort to complement each other. So the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission was pleased to make our submission and publication on the Commission on the Future of Policing last year, and to see many of our own recommendations come to the fore, not least, and Commissioner Harris referred to it already, that we should work with Garda Síochána as the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission in an effort to support them to fulfil their responsibilities on human rights and equality. In particular, we strongly welcome the fact that the report set out as a first principle that human rights are the foundation and purpose of policing. This is a fundamental and crucially important starting point for any reform being carried out in our police service, and has to be the starting point also in assessing and improving An Garda Síochána's capacity for policing and the exercise of its powers that is appropriate, proportionate, and meets the needs of the community. Human rights are, of course, also a fundamental principle underpinning the public sector duty. Again, Commissioner Harris referred to the public sector duty, known hereafter as the Public Sector Equality and Human Rights Duty here in Ireland, to which all public bodies are now legally obliged since November 2014. I was also struck by the degree to which the report appeared to take, I shouldn't say appeared, I say appeared because I'm not sure, I wasn't involved in the discussions, but it looks from the report that the Commission appeared to take a comprehensive approach to human rights, going beyond statements of just principle and suggesting very concrete institutional changes, including the creation within An Garda Síochána of a dedicated high-level human rights unit, as well as the appointment, which was mentioned earlier on, of an independent human rights advisor to the proposed new Policing and Community Safety Oversight Commission. In fact, that's an error on my part. I think Drew Harris referred to an internal within AGS independent advisor. I also note that in advance of these changes that An Garda Síochána has taken the welcome initiative of re-establishing its Strategic Human Rights Advisory Committee, now chaired by Drew Harris, in which our Commission colleagues, Professor Siobhan Mullally, in her capacity as Director of the Centre for Human Rights here at NUIG, and Sonny McDonough, a member of the Commission, will participate. These moves towards a new human rights focus infrastructure within An Garda Síochána have the potential to provide a framework within which human rights and equality can be firmly embedded in the ethos and the operations of An Garda Síochána at all levels, and are most welcome. It's worth pointing out, however, that the reforms on a macro level of institutional infrastructure are only one part of placing human rights at the heart of policing. And I'm well aware from my own previous experience in any large organisation, like An Garda Síochána, it's not unusual for an informal hierarchy of importance to develop. I witnessed this myself in 2014 during the inquiry into the taking into care of the 2 Roma children from their families by Gardaí, where Gardaí reported their perception that their contribution to community policing was perceived as less important than other areas of law enforcement. Equally important are the more subtle but hugely impactful shifts in outlook, approach and attitude that ordinary Gardaí and members of An Garda Síochána can undergo in their daily dealings with the public and within communities. Good infrastructure, good leadership, guidance and recognition for all contributions at all levels can encourage such a shift. It's at the level of those members working in close proximity with communities that human rights and equality of treatment will truly be mainstreamed in policing in Ireland. I'm very glad to hear the Commissioner refer to Section 42, the Human Rights and Equality public duty here in Ireland, and this in simple terms, as he referred to, is what public sector duty is about. As we outlined in our own submission on the Commission to the on our own submission to the Commission on the future of policing and elsewhere, the public sector human rights and equality duty has a key role to play in policing reform agenda. Over the past number of years, the Commission has stressed the potential of the public sector duty as it holds as a catalyst for institutional reform across the state, an entry point, if you like, for institutions of state to reframe their work and the services they provide with a human rights and equality perspective. Indeed, where reform of policing is concerned, the Commission has been of the view that the duty is a crucial means by which An Garda Síochána and all bodies involved in policing can ensure human rights and equality are embedded in every aspect of this crucial public service. The public sector human rights and equality duty was introduced in statute in November 2014 through the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission Act, which places now a legal obligation on all public bodies in the state to perform their functions with regard to the need to eliminate discrimination, to promote equality of opportunity and treatment, both for its staff and the people to whom it provides services, and to protect the human rights of its members, staff, and the persons to whom it provides services. And this is very much in line with the key principles governing the new policing reform agenda. The Commission, over the past 24 months, we put considerable efforts into trying to maximise on the public sector duty. Again, we're at the early stage of trying to encourage people. I know the word encourage sounds terribly soft and people feel that it's far too soft, but it's really speaking to the spirit of the legislation, is that we're working collaboratively, as Drew Harris mentioned, in an effort to make people feel enabled to undertake and take on this new responsibility. We ran a significant number of pilots, 6 pilots around the country, 2 in county councils, Cork and Monaghan, the probation service, the Irish Prison Service, with a higher education institution, UCZ, and with the Community Action Network, who are working on the ground with people who are opioid users. On foot of this work, last month we launched our guide on implementing the public sector equality and human rights duty, and please, you're welcome to go to our website or to contact us if you'd like a hard copy. And this month we're undertaking an extensive public awareness campaign, including through targeted online adverts, to promote the duty amongst Ireland's public and civil servants. We also established a professional diploma in human rights and equality, accredited. Sorry, I'm sorry. Am I going too fast? Sorry.
Just 15 minutes.
I'm only on page 4, so I must have exhausted you. Sorry. It's Noeline putting me under pressure. Given the reform agenda we're discussing today, it's very encouraging that the duty is finding a ready audience at all levels in An Garda Síochána, and I was delighted to hear Drew Harris make explicit reference to the public sector duty this morning. The Minister also made reference to the Different CISU recruitment drive and the lifting on restrictions on the wearing of headwear such as turbans and hijabs. And this is an example of the public sector duty in action. It's also an excellent example in practice of what leadership can look like. Some of you will be well aware that this case and the appeal in this case dates back to the Equality Authority's case, and our intervention as more recently as the Commission. As a state body, we're very careful in terms of our strategic litigation and how we use taxpayers' money, and the Minister referred to taxpayers' money. So this was a case where the National Equality Body was taking a case to the Irish courts to try and challenge what was a practice and now has been changed without legislation, but in a change of leadership and in a change of attitude. And I make this point because I want to just emphasise the importance and the willingness that it takes in leadership and cultural shift to change many of the things that we experience in policing here in Ireland. The second piece that I want to speak to is about cultural competence. And the need for diversity in our own police service is an area in which the Commission has stressed the need for improvements for a number of years, part of our wider discussion of the need for a police service that is culturally competent. The Commission is firmly of the view that in order to enhance trust within the community, it is imperative that the police service in Ireland fully reflects the diversity of Irish society. Good policing requires a police service that understands its community, is responsive to a community's needs and the challenges it faces. Cultural competence was one of the key themes of, when I say the Commission, I'm assuming we're the only Commission now that the Commission on the Future Policing is functus officio. Is that okay? So when I say Commission, I'm talking us. Is that all right? In case anyone's confused. But what I do want to talk about cultural competence is really concerns that have been raised at international level in relation to racial profiling in the context of policing in Ireland. It has been criticised by the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, and this is work we're now looking at as a Commission this year in preparation later this year for Ireland's appearance again before the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. While there is a commitment by the state and by AGS to not employ such methods, recent years have demonstrated a lack of capacity to adhere to the publicly expressed commitment of such a policy. In terms of my personal experience, this is perhaps best illustrated by the incident in 2013, where the Roma children were removed from their families in Athlone and Tala. And Gardaí, who were not fully informed about their communities and didn't fully understand their communities, responded in a disproportionate way. And this response was met by the families with absolute deference to guards and state authority that they were absolutely terrified of. On Gardaí, you must be sensitive to the fact that a visit by a member to a family's home or an invitation to accompany a member to a local Garda station might not have the same quality of informality that they think in the context of the family in question. And this is especially so where a family may, for various reasons, feel under pressure to comply with the request from An Garda Síochána to come to a station, notwithstanding the voluntary nature of such a request. More recently, concerns about racial profiling and more generally about An Garda Síochána's capacity to engage in particular with young people, and I'm delighted to hear Charlie Flanagan talk about community policing, while he did give the example of, he defended the example of guards playing pool with young people. If we understand that methodology as a means of trying to garner support and trust in a young community, it is a really important piece of work. And the young people that we met with 160 young people who travelled from all over Ireland, some of them getting on a bus at 5:30 in the morning to come and tell us their views and their experience of racial discrimination. It wasn't only about policing, but policing did come up in that context. But the young people from diverse ethnic backgrounds, the issue was consistently raised during that consultation with young people. And when I say young people, of course, all of us feel young at heart, but we're talking about young people between the ages of 16 to 24. And that's part of our own participation work on the UN committee examination later in the year. In addition to diversifying the membership to better reflect Irish society, crucial to fostering cultural competence within the Gardaí is comprehensive human rights and equality training. And such training, we would suggest, is not merely a 2-day training that happens in Templemore, but should be a continuous career-long process. And I'm pleased to see that the principle reflected in recommendation 2 of the report of the Commission on the Future of Policing. But cultural competence is, of course, much more than about simply racial profiling, but I did want to mention it as it's a strategic priority of the Commission. But it's about the ease with which a police service can engage with, can understand and appropriately serve a diverse community. It's about anticipating their needs and challenges that they face. And it's about understanding that an individual's experience of an incident or of an interaction with a member of An Garda Síochána or their perception as a victim may vary greatly depending on their background, their capacity, and their circumstance and experience. For this reason, cultural competence is not only about ethnic diversity, but a more modern and a wider diversity that we see in this country. This also includes diversity of age. The Commission was pleased last year to act for 2 Garda candidates in the European Court of Justice in Luxembourg, which ruled that the Workplace Relations Commission had the power to disapply national law when it conflicts with EU law. You'll remember the case of 2 Gardaí who applied to become members of An Garda, but because they were over the age of 35, they were not considered. We hope that this judgment will permit people with a wider and deeper range of expertise and life experience to apply to become members of An Garda Síochána. Cultural competence is also about the ability of AGS to respond to the needs of people with disabilities in our communities. Last year, as you know, Ireland ratified the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. The Convention reflects a shift away from reflects a shift in the way disability and the way people with disabilities are seen, moving away from a medical and very much a charitable model in Ireland to a model of disability as a social and a human rights model, a model that views the way society is organised as being disabling to the individual rather than the impairment itself. Making the principles and standards underpinning this convention a reality represents a significant societal challenge for all of us in Ireland and will require significant institutional and, most importantly, cultural and attitudinal shift. AGS, in their daily dealings with the public on the front lines, including with people with disabilities, will need to be leaders in this cultural change. As our respondent today, Dr. Alan Cusack, has remarked, the capacity of members of An Garda Síochána to respond appropriately, sympathetically and respectfully to the concerns of people with disability is a major factor in shifting and shaping their overall experience of the criminal justice system. This too is cultural competence, the capacity to adopt and project the cultural change that the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities demands of state actors. I'm on my final page now. 2 minutes. To keep the Commission close to the issues and to assist us in our independent oversight mechanism of the Convention, we have set up a competition for our Disability Advisory Committee. We've now had 2 meetings already, and I have to say, such a fantastic group and such a profound experience for all of us engaged in it. But our job is about trying to advance the CRPD, which I know Alan will speak to. In closing up, really, what I want to say is that the theme of human rights and policing, of course, is far more expansive than I have detailed here, but I'm conscious that there are 4 of us speaking this morning, and we have tried to not duplicate each other's work. My final comment just is in relation to the need for Ireland to ratify the optional protocol to the UN Convention Against Torture, which many people in this room will be familiar with. The Commission has recommended to the UN that we are happy to play our part in being the coordinating mechanism. I know Liam will probably refer to it, and this is probably a good moment to close and thank you all for listening and to hand back to Noeline. Thank you.
Well done. Thank you very much, Emily. And I know you're struggling with a cold and a cough as well, so you did well there. So I'm going to move straight on to the next speaker, and Emily has mentioned something that's probably the most important thing I will say about him, and that is he's from Cork. And indeed, he's not the only Cork man on the panel either. But Liam Herrick is the Executive Director of the Irish Council for Civil Liberties. And in the way that the Commission for Human Rights and Equality is the national institution, the Irish Council for Civil Liberties is that long-standing guardian in the non-governmental sector, guarding the civil liberties of this country. And Liam has been in that post, again, his biography is in your packs. He's been in that post for, nearly over 2 years now, Liam, yeah? The time has flown. And before that, he worked with a good Galway man, the President of Ireland, Michael D. Higgins, and he was also his work in the Irish Penal Reform Trust and elsewhere will inform what he has to say. Again, the Irish Council for Civil Liberties made a submission to the Commission on the Future of Policing, which was very helpful in directing the discussions there as well. So I'll hand over to Liam Herrick, and you're under the same time constraints, Liam. Thanks.
Good morning, still I think. I feel a bit conflicted because I'm under pressure to speak faster because of Noeline, to speak slower because of my friend here doing the interpretation for Irish Sign Language, and apparently different rules apply to people that come from Cork, which is a fixation with Noeline among other people. What I propose to speak about this morning, as Noeline said, I'm the director of the Irish Council for Civil Liberties. We're a national-based human rights organisation, and we have been campaigning for Garda reform since we were established in 1976. I want to say a little bit about where we're coming from. We are an organisation that was set up by Irish people concerned primarily actually with the issue of policing. So it's a specific Irish perspective, where we come from, what our beliefs and our values are about this issue, and then how that informs how we react to the Commission on the Future Policing. What we think are going to be the make or break points as to whether it succeeds, and what we feel are the really big priorities, the key priorities in moving forward. And it's a challenge to get through all of that in 15 minutes, but we'll do our best. The first thing to say is we were set up in response to concerns about human rights and policing. The Irish Council for Civil Liberties was set up by Kader Asmal, Mary Robinson and Donald Barrington in the summer of 1976, at a time when the government was trying to push through the Oireachtas emergency powers legislation that would ultimately lead to the resignation of Cruel O'Dálaig. that would significantly reduce the rights of suspects in criminal trials. It was a time when capital punishment was a reality in Ireland, and it was a time when there were documented instances, documented subsequently by Amnesty International, of guards abusing suspects in custody. The so-called allegations around the Heavy Gang and the circumstances which would lead up to the Salons Train trial a number of years later. At the first steering group meeting of ICCL held in Dublin in Trinity College in 1976 in April, there were 4 aims of the organisation: the rights of mental patients, which of course is an unresolved issue; the reform of the law relating to women and children, to which of course has been great progress; a survey of political and cultural censorship, again where there's been a lot of progress; and the need for a civilian police authority to supervise the functioning of the Garda Síochána. If you're looking at impact assessment, the fact that it took 38 years for that goal to be realised is probably not a great reflection on our success as an organisation, but with the policing authority we eventually got there. Over the intervening 43 years, policing has been our main priority issue. We've made numerous submissions to government on police powers, on police oversight, on complaints, publishing Know Your Rights guides for the public to inform their interaction with the police. And ultimately, there's been a lot of success with issues such as the establishment of the Garda Ombudsman and, of course, more recently, the Policing Authority. We've raised these issues with UN bodies and the Council of Europe. We've taken part in the Guard's Strategic Human Rights Advisory Committee over the years. We care very deeply about policing, but not just because of police powers, arrests, and so on. Police we see as the primary interface between the human rights of the citizen and the power of the state. It infuses areas such as immigration, equality, the position of women and children in society, the privacy of individuals. It is the most important human rights issue. And I suppose that is the perspective we bring to the issue. When it comes to the question of a human rights-based approach to policing in the context of Garda Síochána, we believe, first of all, that policing must be based in law. And I think the Minister addressed this with the promise for codification of a lot of the powers that are to come. But similarly, we would argue that human rights are law too. So we basically encapsulated our comprehensive view of human rights-based policing in a submission that we made to the Commission on Future Policing, prepared for ICCL by Barrister Eilis Kilpatrick, who will be speaking to you later on today. And one of the key messages we've got across in this publication is that human rights standards are not some abstract aspiration. They are of legal force. The rights set out in the Irish Constitution and in the European Convention on Human Rights are legal obligations on the state, and individual members of Garda Síochána are duty holders and have a legal responsibility to uphold those rights. The second point is that human rights must be enforced through accountability and oversight. And this means complaints systems, and it means legal oversight of Garda Síochána. I might come to that a little bit later. We also have the value that we should learn from international practice. And I think this has been of particular relevance with regard to the experience in Northern Ireland. Since 2003, when we published a report, Why Patents Should Apply in Ireland, we strongly believe that while the system in the north is far from perfect, and it has many of the problems that we have here too, there is a great deal we can learn from what's happened and the changes that have had there, and I think the Commissioner spoke to that earlier. And obviously he has a particular personal perspective on this, having led some of the reforms in that jurisdiction. At the same time, we believe that there's a lot to value in the Irish tradition of policing, which we must cherish and retain, particularly the unarmed tradition of Garda Síochána, the consensual model of policing we have here, and the emphasis traditionally on community policing. And ultimately, we see human rights reform as being about people and about organisations. It's about questions of efficiency, agency, and qualities that transcend the substance, if you like. It means values of ethical behaviour, transparency, truthfulness, integrity. And it is about understanding more than anything else that your role in upholding the rule of law is not just about upholding the authority of the state. It is about upholding the rule of law in its broadest sense, about the democratic values, the rights and freedoms of individuals. So that's where we come from, that's what we believe, that's what we submitted to the Commission on the Future Policing, and we were happy to say that most of the key recommendations and the views which we expressed were ultimately taken on board by the Commission on the Future Policing. As Noeline has just said, the human rights principle is the first principle in its report. So we were deeply satisfied with the outcome of the report. We believe the vision it articulates is correct. We believe that the will behind the report, and we take what the Minister and the Government has said at face value. We believe the will is genuine from government, from the leadership of the organisation. We believe that this vision and design is correct, but the question then is, will it succeed? So I think the way we approach this really, and we set it out in our report, are what are the things that make processes of change succeed or fail? If we look at the recent reports from the Policing Authority, particularly the 7th interim report that it published just earlier this month, it pointed, and again the report published yesterday, it pointed to the series of reports for Garda reform which have been unsuccessfully implemented. And we can go back further before the Policing Authority was set up to the Morris report and so on as well. We have a series, a pattern of ambitious recommendations for reform which are ultimately not successfully implemented. What does this tell us? It tells us that from an organisational perspective, there are broken links in the chain from the decision to change to the reality. So we in our report identify what we think are the crucial tests, and we think that this has been vindicated again. It reflects, I think, the thinking of the Policing Authority as well. First of all, is there willingness to reform, not just at the top, which we believe is there now, which may not have been there in the past, but is that willingness to reform general, permeated through the organisation? I think that's an open question. It won't happen of itself. We need to bring the rank and file along with us. We need to engage in management systems that ensure the policies at the top are actually reached on the ground. Is the organisation representative of society? I think this again has been touched on by Emily in terms of recruitment, in terms of the increasing diversity of our society. Is the organisation capable of developing, publishing and making known to the public its policies, and to do so in a way that is informed by human rights expertise? To date, that is clearly not the case. And will we see this into the future? It's a fundamental issue of public confidence. How can the public have confidence in an organisation and in a system of policing when it doesn't know what the policies of that organisation are? And I'll illustrate a couple of examples of that in a moment. The fourth area is the question of oversight. We know that reform won't happen unless there is robust oversight. The analogy that the Commissioner used of steel on steel. So the complaint system is not functioning effectively, and the Commission on the Future Policing makes recommendations for an overhaul of GSOC. That is absolutely essential. In relation to the other oversight structures, there are recommendations there about changes. I think the key thing here is that we retain the successes of the Policing Authority and the Garda Inspectorate and build on them. There's one crucial aspect, though. The new oversight functions must have an inspection of police detention, something that has never happened up to now, which is linked to the question of Ireland ratifying the optional protocol to the Convention Against Torture. We also suggest that it might be worth looking at the possibility of the system of lay custody visits as you have in Northern Ireland, which seems to be an effective safeguard in that jurisdiction. We also look at the fact that we believe reform must be underpinned by law. And what we mean by that is this question of codification that the Minister talked about. Having powers of arrest and detention and the use of force actually clearly prescribed in law and accountable to the courts. Also, we would say, having areas such as the regulation of suspects, audiovisual recording, the right of access to a solicitor during questioning set out in law. So we think these are the make or break points. And in fairness to the Commission on Future Policing, it gets into the nitty-gritty of these questions because it had the expertise on it of management consultants, people that had worked in organisational change outside of the criminal justice sphere. The question, of course, is delivery. And in delivery, there must be priorities. So, I suppose to conclude, there's just 4 priorities that we see as being particularly important in the overall system. The first area of priority is the area of public order and protest. This is a human rights issue in terms of freedom of expression and freedom of assembly. And we believe this is particularly important for a number of reasons. First of all, it is totemic and symbolic of the neutrality, political neutrality of the police of any state, how it engages with political dissenters, including some people in an Irish context that might reject the authority of the state at all. How do you engage with them? Are you neutral in your interactions with them? Are you acting on behalf of the interests of business or property, for example? And this, we believe, is where this question of police themselves re-understanding their role as being not about authority, but being about upholding democratic values is really pressing. It's also, of course, in terms of symbolism, hugely significant, because when policing of protest goes wrong, it is very public. It has a huge corrosive effect on public authority, so public confidence. So when we look at recent years, over the last 20 years, we've had a number of unfortunate incidents where the policing of protests went wrong, and that does a huge potential damage to the organisation. We also think this is important because it's complicated. It's technical, it's difficult, it engages the use of force, it engages issues around surveillance and technology, and it engages with complex questions about community engagement. And it's also, we would say, very exciting because there are a lot of models of good practice to pull from. We're part of an international network of civil liberties organisations. We published a report last year called Defending Dissent, which picks on best practice models from around the world and how you can manage protests more effectively. Northern Ireland, again, has made enormous progress in the most difficult of contexts in terms of setting good rules for the management of protest, with a clear emphasis on preliminary engagement with the actors involved. And over the course of the next couple of months, we aim to publish a Know Your Rights guide for protesters, which will articulate their rights and we hope help their engagement with the police. And the Garda Inspectorate is doing work on this at the moment as well. So we think this would be an early win, and we think one of huge importance. It's also an area where I think, given the social context in Ireland, we can realistically aspire to having best practice. I think it's an area where we can claim that we could aim for something very, very good and positive. The second area is what I broadly categorise as data integrity. The use of information by An Garda Síochána. And the first thing I would say is that if we don't have accurate information about what is actually happening in Irish policing, we can't make good policy and we can't have real and meaningful public confidence in terms of actually understanding what's happening. We know that the systems of data collection and management at the moment are wholly inadequate. The CSO has obviously made its own judgments on that. But it's also an essential safeguard. If we don't know accurately what's happening about the use of force, for example, the use of pepper spray or non-lethal weapons, which we know is not accurately reflected at the moment, if we don't know how many arrests are happening around public order events, if we don't know how much stop and search is happening. We can't engage with issues such as racial profiling. So again, we have precedents from nearby jurisdictions of where this has worked well, and we know where it's really led to very significant changes over time. At the same time, we would caution against a slavish devotion to numbers in terms of policing goals. And I think we don't have to look beyond the United States, where we'll see that too much of an emphasis on more arrests and more detection is not conducive to good policing, or the type of vision of community and preventive policing that the Minister articulated earlier today. And finally, with regard to data, I think we have a deep cultural problem in Irish policing about respect for privacy and data protection in terms of the control that the guards have of personal information and their attitude and respect for that data. There's a number of instances of where this has come to the surface in recent years, but I think it's something that we need to look at, particularly in light of the changing legislative environment because of GDPR. Okay, 2 minutes. The third area is the question of surveillance and security. That will be dealt with later today, so I won't go into that in any great detail. But I would say that that is, from a human rights perspective, hugely important. The history of Garda abuse and when guards have gone wrong, policing in Ireland has gone wrong, is almost always associated with the use of exceptional powers in non-exceptional circumstances, the contamination of ordinary policing by secrecy and exceptionalism, and the need for a legal framework and authorisation of all covert activity and clear, transparent policies is an absolute priority. That's not to say, of course, that there aren't special sensitivities with covert activity. Of course there are, but that doesn't mean that you don't have oversight. It just means a different type of oversight, which extends to questions such as how we share intelligence with other jurisdictions, for example. And at the moment, the public in Ireland have no vision whatsoever of what the systems of intelligence sharing we have are. And the fourth area that I'll just address briefly is, we think, an urgent priority must be dealing with the past. We are, of course, moving forward, but there are unresolved issues which, if not addressed, will continue to undermine any potential for change. And when I say by dealing with the past, I'll give you some examples. There are a number of very serious historic cases which are still not addressed. For example, the treatment of Johanna Hayes and her family in Kerry in the 1980s. We've had an apology, but we don't know what the apology was for. We don't know yet what happened where policing went very wrong in that instance. I referred earlier to the Salons robbery, for example. There are still many outstanding questions there. We haven't had a proper exposition of the role of Irish policing in the institutionalisation of women and children and the violations that happened in that context. And even, I would say, about recent years, the scandals of the last 20 years. There's still a lot of unanswered questions. I would say that the recent reaction of the organisation and of the leadership of Garda Síochána to the difficulty with the Garda diversion programme, for example, was refreshing and impressive, that there was a sense of revealing what had happened and engaging with it. And that's the kind of thing that will make a real difference. Finally, so I've gone through where we're coming from, what we're about, why we think what we think the pressure points are, what we think the priorities must be. But I just want to end on a positive note. The overused quotation from Michael Staines, the first commissioner, that the Garda Síochána will succeed not by force of arms, but by their moral authority as servants of the people. If you read Conor Brady's history of Garda Síochána, that early period, he emphasises the altruism and idealism of the first generation of members of Garda Síochána. And I think that's an ethos that has persisted through the organisation despite difficulties over the years. We're not cynical about reform. We're optimistic and hopeful of a very positive vision. And we have a landmark coming in a couple of years' time with the centenary of Garda Síochána. We think, with the Commission on Future Policing, there is a vision there for an exceptional police service in Ireland and an exceptional policing culture. But it won't just happen by rhetoric. And we've had rhetoric for 20 years from Ministers for Justice and Garda Commissioners about setting best practice and all the rest of it. But it hasn't happened. So I think we need to marry a sense of ambition with a real resolution to get into the nitty-gritty of organisational change. And I think it ultimately is all about culture. And culture takes a lot of time to change. But if there's will, if there's design, if there's leadership, and if there's investment in management culture, then we really believe that this can happen, and we want to be part of that change. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you very much for that, Liam. Now, already I have loads of things I would like to comment on, and I'm not going to do any of that because we now have two people who are called respondents, or who will be in some way commenting on what has gone ahead. Are we going in the order of Alan first? Yeah, so Alan Cusack is another Cork man, all right, that's got that over with. But he's a lecturer in law in the University of Limerick. He's a solicitor, and he's also the director in the university of the postgraduate studies there, and the course director for the Master of Arts in Serious Crime. I quite like that idea myself of doing a Master of Arts in Serious Crime. It's a great title. So anyway, Alan, I'm going to invite you to come and do your response, and you've less time than each of the other two speakers. Do you remember? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Noeline, and I'm delighted to act as a respondent or a discussant for both Liam and Emily's papers this morning. So over the course of the next 10 minutes, I'm just going to elaborate upon and respond to some of the key points which have been raised in the two papers in this session. I suppose just as a general introductory remark, I think it's valuable to note at the outset just how timely the two contributions that we've heard this morning are, coming as they do at the end of a week which saw the publication of two reports on the intersection of human rights and policing. So as I'm sure many of you are aware, yesterday the Policing Authority produced its assessment on the implementation of the 2018 policing plan. And while that assessment or report I recognised considerable improvements in many police practices across the country, the report also identified a number of outstanding challenges, and in that regard I think it's echoed some of the concerns that we've heard in Liam and Emily's paper. In particular, the need for improved responsiveness in terms of addressing the needs and concerns of victims of hate crime was identified in yesterday's report. Along similar lines, on Tuesday, the ICJDN, the Irish Criminal Justice and Disability Network, also published a report which again identified concerns around our institutional response to hate crime. The report highlighted in particular a specific need or an unmet need for improved or increased disability awareness training within An Garda Síochána. So in light of those two recent publications, and in order to frame my response to both Liam and Emily's papers within the spirit and the content of the Commission's report last September, I'm going to confine my comments very specifically to one specific issue, and that is police responses to incidents of disableist victimisation. So in other words, I want to talk about the experience of crime victims who have intellectual disabilities, their experience when they approach An Garda Síochána in the aftermath of a crime. So just to set the context, very little is still known in Ireland about how persons with intellectual disabilities experience crime. And this goes back to the data issues that Lee mentioned. Neither the Garda Public Attitude Survey or the National Household Survey provide any formal breakdown of crime prevalence rates based on disability. Moreover, the National Disability Survey does not give any focus on disability-specific victimisation. So really steps to try and fill this data lacuna were only adopted in November 2015 with an update in the Garda Pulse system, which now allows us to monitor anti-disability motives for crime. So as a result of this long data absence, our knowledge of how persons with intellectual disabilities experience crime is still fragmented. However, the limited statistics that do exist would suggest that disableist victimisation is a prevalent issue in Ireland. So just to give you one example, A study published in 2016 by Inclusion Ireland said that the level of recorded sexual offences against persons with intellectual disabilities grew from 12 incidents in 2014 to 22 incidents in 2015, and that represented an increase in victimisation of 83%. And again, this trend, I don't have time to go through it today, but if you were to look at the anecdotal evidence that's been amassed by the Hate Hostility Research Group in UL, again, there's anecdotal evidence to say that fear of victimisation is very real amongst persons with intellectual disabilities. I just have one quote here from Jim Winters of Inclusion Ireland from a 2015 study. Fear is the common word used within intellectual disability, or to explain their experience of abuse or assault, or to explain their fear of participating in mainstream events. They're afraid of being targeted, they're afraid of being robbed, and they're afraid of being assaulted. So having set the context, I just want to return to the Commission's report last September. And as I'm sure you're aware, the Commission, the report included a number of major structural recommendations for reform. And the key one that I want to speak about is located in Chapter 20 of that report, where the Commission talk about the need to mainstream disability awareness training within An Garda Síochána. So the report said that police are often first on the scene in situations where the key problem is mental illness or drug abuse. It is vital that they know how to recognise such problems when they encounter them. We recommend enhanced training in mental health and substance misuse awareness, at least part of it jointly with members of the relevant expert services. So recommendations of this nature that we saw in the report are not new. They were not new in September last year, and indeed they can be traced back as far as 1996. The Commission on the Status of People with Disabilities then commented as follows. Disability awareness training should be provided to all Gardaí and other persons working in this area as part of their general training. And certainly there have been some positive developments towards cultivating improved disability awareness training within An Garda Síochána. The launch of the Diversity Works training scheme in 2006, the introduction of Policing with Communities module in Templemore, and the BA in Applied Policing Programme, the rollout in 2017 of enhanced cognitive interview training as part of the GSIM model. They're all very welcome developments. So too has been the swifter than predicted rollout of the 10 Divisional Protective Services units last year. And again, that was identified as a positive development in the Policing Authority's report yesterday. However, as Liam and indeed Emily's paper in particular reminds us, and the reports this week, there remains scope for further improvements in this area. It's particularly evident, I think, from Emily's paper and from the research that was produced this week, that while disability awareness training may well be an element or a constituent element of Garda training in the Garda College now, not all members of An Garda Síochána have shared equally in the benefits of this tuition. As a result, the response which will greet a victim of a crime who has an intellectual disability in the aftermath of that wrongdoing cannot be predicted. Again, I just have a quote here from a study from Schenkel Cummins and Claire Edwards from 2013. And a respondent there said, victims of crimes experience depends on the individual Garda that they meet. Some are terrific, some are fantastic, and some are not. There are huge barriers when you meet up with them. So to put this in a human rights perspective, in accordance with this session, as primary gatekeepers of Ireland's criminal justice system, members of An Garda Síochána have unparalleled influence over the trajectory of a complaint. Moreover, as first responders to alleged incidents of wrongdoing, they are uniquely placed to shape a victim's initial experience of our criminal justice system. And for these reasons, as Emily pointed out, it is essential that they adopt a sympathetic and a disability awareness approach when dealing with victims of crime of intellectual disabilities. The adoption of a presumptively dismissive attitude or the application of inappropriate interviewing techniques not only risks prejudicing the quality of the evidence that will be excavated during an investigation, but it also risks reinforcing traditional constructions of incapacity. And again, that's something that the social model of disability under the Convention would certainly be in conflict with. As Liam said, these are not simply moral imperatives, these are legal imperatives. The adoption of a disability-insensitive approach cannot be reconciled with Ireland's international obligations under the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities or the Victims Directive at an international level. Closer to home, at a national level, a disability-insensitive approach cannot be reconciled with our national obligations under Part 3 of the Criminal Justice Victims of Crime Act 2017, nor can such an approach be reconciled with the state's obligation to vindicate the life, person, good name and property rights of every citizen under Article 40.3.2 of Bunreacht na hÉireann. So, no, I'm at the very end now, Noeline. But if we think about it in the context of An Garda Síochána turning 100 in just 3 years' time, so the 100th anniversary of Garda Síochána is on the horizon, and alongside us we now have the support of the Commission's report from last September, as well as this public sector duty that Emily spoke about. An Garda Síochána has a unique opportunity in this regard to retailer its services and its training programmes in order to better respond to the individuated needs and the human rights of all consumers of Ireland's criminal justice process.
Thank you very much. Actually bringing on new points as well to add to the list of things I wouldn't mind talking about now as well. But our final speaker in this session and our respondent is Eilis Barry, who has one of the best jobs in Ireland, I think, because she's CEO of FLAC, the Free Legal Advice Centres, which is the job I had before I moved to the Dublin Rape Crisis Centre. Eilis is a barrister herself and has specialised in employment law, discrimination and equality, and was head of the legal section of the Equality Authority and its legal advisor for a number of years as well. So the topic of equality is absolutely core to her work. So Eilis, I'll invite you now to come up and give your response. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Noeline. It would be a lot easier to carry out the job before Noeline had actually carried out the job, I have to say. Very, very big shoes to fill. I'd also just like to thank Donegal for organising this event. I'm really looking forward to the rest of the day. FLAC very much welcomed the unequivocal statement in the Commission on the Future of Policing that human rights are the foundation and the purpose of policing, and also its commitment in relation to the core value of policing with communities. FLAC is a legal rights body that has been campaigning for access to justice for 50 years. As of yesterday, it was our 50th birthday. And approximately 25,000 people per annum receive basic legal information from our information line and network of legal advice communities all around the country. And I can never speak at a legal conference without realising and wanting to acknowledge that there's invariably some of our FLAC volunteers in the audience, and they're here today. So I just wanted to thank them. FLAC identifies and makes policy and law reform proposals in areas of law that most affect disadvantaged communities. And we try and bring cases that are in the public interest, that is, cases that have a value beyond the individual. Of particular relevance to today, and also FLAC's submission to the Commission, is our work in relation to the Justram programme, which was a joint EU and Council of Europe initiative to promote access to justice for travellers and members of the Roma community. And we have run legal clinics for travellers and members of the Roma community, and are currently operating a Roma legal clinic with the assistance and support of the Department of Justice. And we're also trying to get another traveller legal clinic off the ground. I note that one concern yesterday in the Police Authority assessment of police performance is the lack of progress in relation to diversity and inclusion strategies. And that raises the question, to me at least, is the extent to which An Garda Síochána and all of the supervising oversight bodies and accountabilities have in fact taken concrete steps to implement the duty that Emily was talking about. And Has there actually been an assessment to date, as is required, of the human rights and equality issues relevant to all of the functions of these bodies? And have they devised policies, plans and actions to put these in place? And if so, have these been published, and are they acknowledged in relevant strategic plans? And are improvements recorded in the annual reports, as is required by that duty? And I suppose, bearing in mind that that public sector equality and human rights duty is actually a legal requirement, it isn't something that is an optional extra, and has been in place since 2014. Criminal law matters only take up about 7% of queries to our phone line and in our clinics, and FLAC doesn't normally touch on the issue of criminal legal aid, because comparatively it's a much better system than our civil legal aid system. But one issue that has arisen that has come in on the phone line in relation to the guards and people with disabilities was an individual with a severe intellectual disability who also had psychiatric issues, who has been invited to be questioned by An Garda Síochána in relation to allegations of serious sexual misconduct. Now, in that regard, there is no legal aid available, either for people with disabilities or without. There isn't legal aid available at that stage of the process. But for someone with an intellectual disability or a severe psychiatric illness, it would be a cause of great concern if such an interview were to take place without legal representation. And we spoke to criminal lawyers who cautioned us under no circumstance to allow that interview to take place, and who were so concerned that they offered to go and attend the interview on a pro bono basis with the individual in question. And I think that's something that needs to be addressed. Related to this is the gap in protection in the equality legislation, and Alan was talking about the rights of people with disabilities. Now, specifically, while the Equal Status Act prohibits discrimination and harassment in the provision of goods and services on 9 grounds, which include the ground of race, the traveller community ground and the disability ground, it also requires the reasonable accommodation of people with disabilities. But our Act isn't as comprehensive as it should be in this regard, and the definition of services in the Equal Status Act is broad enough to include public services, but it has been interpreted as not applying to the performance of functions of public bodies such as the guards, particularly when they're exercising what are called controlling or regulatory functions. So it isn't at all clear that the prohibition on harassment, the prohibition on discrimination, the requirement to provide for people with disabilities is enforceable as against An Garda Síochána, and I think that's a matter that needs to be remedied. Certainly, in cases that have been brought, and the state have been successful to date in arguing that the equal status provisions don't apply to bodies like An Garda Síochána when they're exercising controlling functions. And I think that's something that could be remedied. And if the Equal Status Act was to apply, that would lead to a greater legal impetus to have equality policies and disability policies, because the Act provides it's a defence for respondents to a claim of harassment if they can show that they have appropriate policies in place. Policing issues arise far more frequently in the context of our legal services for travellers and Roma, though the interaction of the different communities arise in different circumstances. For the Roma community, there appear to be a high level of instances of being stopped and questioned as suspects in relation to criminal instances where the person isn't ultimately charged or convicted of the incident concerned. And FLAC's experience with the Just Roma programme is very consistent with the report published on Roma in Ireland, a national needs assessment, where it showed that 53.9% of respondents reported feeling discriminated against by An Garda Síochána and the courts, and 77.5% of respondents reported being stopped by An Garda Síochána for identification, and of these, 55.9% reported being stopped 4 times or more. Emily and Liam and Alan mentioned racial profiling, but we do not have legislation prescribing racial profiling by An Garda Síochána. Emily also mentioned the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination and how it observed in 2011 that we needed legislative provisions prohibiting racial profiling by An Garda Síochána. And the response of the state to CERD was that An Garda Síochána does not, as an institution, engage in discriminatory profiling. However, we saw and heard Emily's description of the investigation she was involved in relation to the removal of 2 Roma children. We believe that we need to have mechanisms in place to detect and prevent and address potential racial profiling by An Garda Síochána. We also think there should be legislative measures that would allow individuals or groups representing their interests to make complaints to GSOC in relation to racial profiling to allow for proper investigation. As things stand, and Liam mentioned the need for accountability, the Policing Authority Code of Ethics for An Garda Síochána includes a section on respect and equality, but the code isn't on a statutory footing, and a breach of the code in and of itself cannot form the basis of a complaint to GSOC, even where non-compliance is at a systemic level. And we believe that's a significant weakness in the area of accountability, and that putting a code of ethics on a statutory footing, subject to necessary amendments and safeguards, is a modest extension to accountability, particularly where there's been such extensive consultation in relation to the code, and the code in any event should be part of the operational requirements of An Garda Síochána. Okay, I want to highlight one example of really good practice by An Garda Síochána. A Roma couple with no criminal convictions were subject to repeated arrests without charge, and FLAC made complaints to the Garda Commissioner and GSOC, and the couple were approached by senior members of An Gardaí who discussed the issue with them and who came to a resolution based on the verification of their identity with the local Garda station. And the couple were extremely happy that the matter had been dealt with so seriously, both by GSOC and the Commissioner. There is one issue of particular concern that I do want to mention, arising from our casework, and it is a matter, I have to say, of some surprise and concern to FLAC, and that's in relation to the interaction of Gardaí in relation to applications for accommodation and assessment of homelessness. If I can highlight this, we received Section 15 of the Housing Act makes provision for the exchange of information between local authorities and a number of specified bodies in relation to antisocial behaviour and allocation of social housing. And we've been surprised at the extent and content of some of the information provided by some guards to the local authorities in this instance. For example, we've seen 3 cases where we've been concerned about the information that has been shared by An Garda Síochána and the local authority, which at times has been anecdotal, has been accurate, and has been misleading in nature, and raises serious concerns in relation both to fair procedures, privacy and data sharing, and which has resulted in applications for social housing or assessments in relation to homelessness being denied or delayed. And this type of information has come to our attention as a result of freedom of information applications, when members of the traveller community have come to us wondering why their assessment of homelessness has been denied, or where offers of accommodation have been withdrawn. And we were surprised in one particular case where An Garda Síochána actually filed an affidavit supporting a local authority where we were challenging the failure of the County Council to consider a family as homeless, and where the affidavit described in some detail road traffic incidences that the applicants had been involved in, which we felt had no actual relevance to the Housing Act and providing relevant information to the local authority in this regard. So if I can sum up and to say that it would be FLAC would really recommend that An Garda Síochána and all of its oversight bodies would implement, as a matter of urgency, the public sector inequality duty. It should be possible to bring a complaint of discrimination or harassment or failure to provide reasonable accommodation under the Equal Status Act in relation to the guards. We urgently need concrete measures prohibiting racial profiling, and we would really wish that An Garda Síochána, in providing information to local authorities in relation to housing matters, need to do so in a manner that is fair, impartial, that it respects privacy and is transparent. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Eilis. Now, again, a vast amount of information in all of those. All of the speakers kept to time, but our time is up, which makes me think I must have gone on too long in the sessions, and I propose to step down from this role almost immediately and hand over to my former colleague on the Commission, Tim Dalton. But just to say, first of all, it has been an honour to be part of this conference here today, and I want to thank Professor Donncha O'Connell and Professor Siobhan Mullally for allowing me to be part. I want to say a big thank you to the interpreters for their great assistance. And if you wouldn't mind, please putting your hands together to give a massive thanks to our 4 speakers, Emily Logan, Liam Herrick, Alan Cusack and Eilis.